Hi, my name's Jonathan, and I'm very pleased to spend some time with you today talking about some of the foundation information and concepts which you need to be aware of to start keeping bees yourself. We're going to start off by taking a look at some of the essential gear that you need to get hold of. But before we do that, I want to just mention a couple of principles which you'll want to bear in mind throughout watching this DVD. The first one is the old saying that however many beekeepers there are in the world today, that's the exact number of unique opinions there are on how to keep bees correctly. Or as my old bee instructor used to put it, if you get 4 beekeepers in a room together to discuss any given aspect of beekeeping, then you'll get at least 5 opinions on how it should be done properly. But don't view that negatively, it's all constructive. Do talk to as many beekeepers as you can, and read as many books and watch as many DVDs as you can, and just take it all on board and work out what works best for you and your bees individually. And that takes us to the second old beekeeping adage, which is that you'll often hear very experienced beekeepers tell you that the books will tell you to do a specific beekeeping task in a very specific way, and if you do, then the bees will react in a specific way, but unfortunately their bees haven't read that particular book. Or in other words, things don't always go according to plan, and we have to bear in mind and respect that the bees will always know far more about making honey than any of us ever will. So there we go, just remember those 2 points. Now in the next video on this DVD, we're going to look at lots of different little contraptions and devices which you'll want to start gathering together and put together a beekeeping kit. But what we've got here is the most essential pieces of gear which you have to obtain even before you get hold of the bees themselves and your first beehive. So what you're going to need, and you cannot be without, is obviously a bee suit of some description to start with. Then you'll need a pair of Wellingtons and a good pair of beekeeping gloves to go with that suit. You will definitely need a beekeeping smoker. And finally, you have to have at least one hive tool.
Okay, so the first piece of essential kit that we said you need is your bee suit or a bee veil. Now a veil is going to be the cheapest option, usually consisting of a hat and the net itself which tucks into the collar of whatever it is you're wearing. If you are going to go down that route, then make sure that the garment you wear is a sweatshirt or a pullover which has elasticated wrists and waist so that no bees can climb up inside it. But the option that most new beekeepers feel most comfortable with is the full overall style bee suit. Now obviously this is going to be the most expensive option, so a good compromise, which a lot of beekeepers go for, is the jacket or smock type bee suit. But whichever one you do go for, it's worth mentioning here that the material that the bee suit is made from is not intended to be sting proof. That's a common misunderstanding people often assume, but it's only made from usually a light cotton material, and the way that it protects you is simply by having a nice loose fitting bee suit, so that there's plenty of folds and plenty of room to keep the suit away from your skin, and that you wear a lightweight but bulky garment underneath the bee suit. Bee stings are only a couple of millimeters long, and all it needs to do is keep that sting away from your skin. Now there's hundreds of different designs of bee suit on the market, but they basically fall into 2 different categories. The traditional bee suit has a ring veil, and on the top of the hood it will have a stiff, sometimes a wire or a plastic ring, which keeps the mesh away from your face, and sometimes another one on the bottom around the neck as it has here. This design has been around the longest, but a newer design starting to gain in popularity is the fencing mask style, as you see here. Now the advantage of this one is that when you unzip it in front of the neck and you fold it back, it will lie flat on your back, which makes it a lot easier to travel to and from your apiary without the hood on, so as you don't get too hot, and you can even drive your car comfortably with this style. But go for the one you feel most comfortable in and you feel most secure in. It's simply a matter of personal choice. But if you are going to go for the jacket or smock type bee suit, then bear in mind that something to be aware of is that at the end of the summer, if you've had a good year and you've got 3, 4 or even 5 supers on top of your beehive, then reaching up to take those supers off, you've got to be careful that you don't expose your midriff to stings by reaching too far. So just bear that in mind if that's what you're going to go for. Now you're also going to need a good pair of beekeeping gloves to go with your bee suit, and traditionally these are made from soft leather, and they have this long forearm gauntlet section so that it overlaps your sleeve by a long distance, and in use it's not going to expose your wrist. But there are cheaper alternatives available as well as the traditional beekeeping gloves. A lot of people just use gardening type gloves. Personally, I use a pair of neoprene gloves. These have been the most sting-proof option I've found, or even strong rubber gloves are readily available and not too expensive. But the important thing with gloves this time is that you want something that isn't too baggy. A lot of the jobs that you're going to need to learn to do within the hive are very intricate and very fiddly, like marking the queen for instance, and having loose-fitting baggy gloves makes it almost impossible to do those things. And the last piece of essential kit to complete your beekeeping outfit is a simple, humble pair of Wellington boots. And the important rule here is to tuck whatever trousers you're wearing into the boots. The reason for this is very simple. Whenever bees land on a vertical or a sloping surface, they will always, for some reason, climb up. They don't like going downhill. So with your trousers tucked into your Wellingtons, when they land on your boot, they will just climb up onto your bee suit. They're not going to go down inside the Wellington. Whereas if you have your trousers over your shoes or Wellingtons, any bees that land on your feet will go up inside your trouser leg. And believe me, having a disoriented bee climbing up the inside of your trouser leg is not something you want to experience for yourself. Now the next piece of essential kit that you're going to need is a smoker. A good bee smoker you can't be without. And a bit later on in the training we have a video dedicated to how you light your smoker, how you use it, the reason why it works and the effect that it has on the bees. But for now we just need to consider what factors to bear in mind in choosing which smoker to buy. Go for a stainless steel one or a galv, something that's not going to rust after a couple of years. And this cage around the smoker is a very good idea because obviously the body's going to get very hot with the fuel smouldering away inside it. But the most important consideration with the smoker when choosing which one to buy is go for the biggest one that you can get. The reason for this is that the more fuel you can fit inside your smoker, the longer it will burn for. And you do not want your smoker to run out when you're inside the hive. You don't want to be working inside the hive when you knock it accidentally or make the bees cross for some other reason and find that your smoker's run out of fuel. And the last piece of essential kit that we mentioned was your hive tool. Now once again there's dozens and dozens of different designs available on the market and all have their different uses and strengths, but they fall into two basic categories, the scraper type and the frame lift type hive tool, sometimes referred to as the American hive tool and the British hive tool. But in deciding which one you're going to go for, there's no need to be patriotic here. The answer is quite simply that you buy both. In terms of the total outlay that you're going to be spending to put together this beekeeping kit, spending a little bit extra and buying both hive tools is going to be well worth the small extra outlay. So I'll explain to you why they both have advantages. First of all, both of them will have this sharp, chisel-like wedge end on them. And that's for the primary function of the hive tool, which is to split the hive when you open it up. You see, once your bees settle into their new home, they make themselves nice and comfortable, they propolize the inside of the hive. Propolis is the glue that they make from tree sap, and they use it to seal up any drafts, any little cracks and joins. So when you come to open the hive, you'll find it stuck firmly together. And you use this sharp wedge end of the hive tool to slip it in between the two and crack them open to break the seal. And then once you're inside the hive, the scraper hive tool comes into its own. You see, you're going to find the crown board here, the queen excluder, and all the frames will be covered in propolis, and they'll also have brace comb quite often on them as well. And this scraper is perfect for cleaning off all that excess unwanted wax and keeping it for later use. And the final primary function of the hive tool, then you switch to the frame lift type. You see, the frames will also be propolized. They'll have some brace comb on them as well quite often, and this little hook on the end here is designed to hook underneath the frame like this and prise it out and break the seal quite easily. And the final point to bear in mind regarding hive tools is to go for one with bright colour on it. You can always add the colour yourself quite easily in bands using coloured tape. And the reason for the bright colours is that before long, when you're travelling to and from your apiary carrying lots of different equipment, you will drop your hive tool, and the bright colours make it much easier to find in long grass. So there you are, that's just a few pointers to help you go out now, get a few beekeeping catalogues, have a look at some beekeeping mail order websites, and start putting together your own essential beekeeping kit. So in the first video, we looked at the most essential pieces of equipment that you absolutely need to acquire to get started in beekeeping. But there are, of course, a whole host of other devices and contraptions which you'll probably want to get hold of and which are going to make your life a lot easier, and you'll want to start putting together as you develop in your beekeeping. So as with the first video, it's simply to introduce you to them, to give you an overview of what they do, to help you decide what you do want to acquire for yourself, and to help you consider the different options available where there are different types and varieties of a product for you to choose between. So in no particular order, let's take a look at some of these pieces of equipment. A frame grip, first of all, is a very useful piece of kit. It's by no means necessary, probably most beekeepers don't bother with them, but if you're going to be inspecting the hives on your own, then being able to hold each frame safely in one hand, leaving your other hand free for your smoker and for various other jobs within the hive, is a real advantage, and many beekeepers wouldn't be without them. So try and borrow somebody else's and have a go with it, see how you get on with it, and if you think it's worth investing in one yourself. The bee brush also is another piece of kit which makes life a lot easier within the hive. Obviously it's made from a very soft bristle, and it's just used to gently brush the bees off an individual comb back into the hive if you need to do sorting out, changing them, or removing specific combs for any reason. The next piece of kit are known as hive straps. Now you can buy them from beekeeping catalogues, but it's much easier to get them, and often they're a lot cheaper if you just buy them from vehicle maintenance stores, from car stalls, where they're simply called ratchet tie-down straps, and they're used for roof racks and for vehicle trailers. They've got this ratchet that you can do up very tight, and you use them to strap up a hive when you're going to be moving it. They keep the hive tightly together to make sure there's no mishaps and that no bees will escape if the hive gets bumped around in transit. And the other reason that you want to get hold of a couple of hive straps is for when it comes to catching swarms. Now, as soon as word gets out that you're keeping bees, it won't be long before people start ringing you up in the spring and summer, or getting in touch with you to let you know that they found a swarm which they want you to deal with. And when you're starting up in beekeeping, if you want to expand, catching a swarm is obviously the best way of getting hold of a free hive of bees. So to catch the swarm, all you'll need is an empty brood chamber. Make sure it's got a floor. Ideally, you'd want a mesh floor to make sure that the bees can breathe when the entrance is closed up, because you need to close the entrance while they're in transit. And once you've got the swarm into the brood chamber, you give them a few frames of undrawn comb, because there's nothing that a swarm of bees likes better than drawing out fresh comb and setting up home. Then you just need to make sure that the queen is in with all the bees, put the crown board on and strap the hive up, and it's ready for transit to its new location nice and safely. And crown boards have another use as well. They're dual purpose. You also use them as clearer boards. This is at the end of summer when the honey flows have finished and you want to remove the honey for extraction. The day before, or a couple of days before you want to extract, you add the clearer boards below the supers, and they have one-way exits on them so that the bees can escape down through the clearer board back into the brood chamber. And when you come along to remove the honey supers a couple of days later, they should be completely empty of bees. Now there's lots of different designs of clearer board and of bee escapes on the market, but the two simplest and cheapest that are easiest for you to get started with are the cone escape and the porter bee escape. The cone escape is simply a one-way exit. It's easy for the bees to go down through the cone, but in the same principle as a lobster pot, it's much harder for them to climb up back into it, up into the honey supers. And the porter bee escapes are just very simple one-way gates made of some loosely sprung wire. Both types are very cheap to get hold of, and you need to make sure that if you're making your own clearer boards, you put a couple of exits on each board. It's no good just having one in case a big old drone gets stuck in it and all the other bees won't be able to escape, and they'll be stuck in the supers for a couple of days. Okay, so you've put your clearer boards on, you've gone back to the hives and you've taken the honey supers on. Now it's time to extract the honey from the frames. And before you can put them into the centrifugal machine to extract the honey, first of all you need to uncap it. And we'll discuss how you uncap in detail later on in the video dedicated to honey extraction and production. But in terms of choosing what equipment you need, there's a couple of simple options available. If you're going to be doing a lot of uncapping, if you've got quite a few hives, then an electrically heated uncapping knife is obviously the best investment. They're not too expensive and they make the job nice and simple. But if you're doing it on a smaller scale, then there's two other simple options which you can go for. First of all, an uncapping fork is very straightforward to use. It's a bit slower than a knife, but the advantage of the fork is that it makes it a lot easier to uncap uneven brood. And in your first couple of years, you'll probably find that you haven't got your bee spacing quite right, and you may be left with some very wobbly combs to deal with. And the fork comes in very handy in this situation. Or the other simple option is just to use a standard thermos flask, fill it with water just off the boil, and insert two fairly long and lightly serrated kitchen knives. Leave them in there for a second to heat up, then just take one out and uncap one side of the frame, return the knife into the hot water, take out the other freshly hot one, and do the other side of the frame. It's a very quick, simple and cheap technique for uncapping large quantities of honey. The other piece of equipment you'll need for uncapping is a large tray to uncap the frames over. You can of course buy purpose-built ones, and they're very well designed like ours here, but you can use any tray and make your own simply by resting a batten of wood over it with a large nail sticking up through it. The point of the nail makes a very good pivot point to rest each frame on, so that you can use one hand to balance it as it rests on the nail and the other hand to handle the uncapping knife or fork. It's a very simple technique and it works very effectively. So now your frames are uncapped, they're ready to be extracted. And this is done by means of a centrifugal honey extractor. They come in all sorts of shapes and sizes and for all budgets as well. It's probably the most expensive piece of equipment that you're going to need to invest in. But they do start off quite reasonably. Whichever type you buy, they all work on exactly the same principle, namely that the centrifugal force that comes from spinning the frames around inside the drum forces the honey out from the frames in exactly the same way that a washing machine pulls the water from clothes when you spin it round at high speed. There's lots of different types on the market and they come for all budgets. Cheaper ones are usually made from food-grade plastic and more expensive ones are made from stainless steel. And cheaper ones have a hand crank on them which you need to turn manually, and more expensive ones will have an electric motor. And if you're going to go for a large capacity machine, anything that takes more than about 10 frames, then you'd probably want one with an electric motor because of the labour involved in spinning those round. The different designs of honey extractor come in two main categories. The cheaper of the two is what's known as a tangential extractor, and the frame in here is designed to hold usually just 3 or 4 frames, and the frames are placed into the frame with only one side of the frame facing the edge of the drum. So you have to spin it once to extract the one side of the frame, then you need to stop, turn the frames around and spin it again to extract the other side. So there's twice the amount of work to be done, but these are the cheapest and smallest capacity type extractors for small scale operations. The larger type then is known as a radial extractor, and the frames are placed in this extractor like the spokes of a wheel or like the points of a star, and as you spin this one around it will extract both sides of the frame at once. So obviously it's half the amount of labour compared to a tangential extractor, and they come in much larger capacities as well. An average size radial extractor will take anything between 10 and 20 frames at once, and you can buy much larger capacity ones as well. But in fact, you don't need to buy a honey extractor at all. As we said, this is probably the single most expensive piece of kit that a beekeeper needs to invest in. But if you join your local beekeeping society, then they will invariably keep a communal extractor which you can either borrow and book in to use, or just hire for a very nominal maintenance charge once a year to do all your extracting in one go. And this is a perfect opportunity for us to mention the importance of joining your local beekeeping society. It's not just about having access to the extractor and other pieces of equipment, and it's not just about getting good advice as well. it's absolutely imperative that you make contact with your local beekeeping organization so that you can keep track of any trends and problems regarding your bees in the local area. And it's equally important that they are able to keep track of you in case there's any health problems with your bees so that they can keep in touch. They will put you in touch with your local government bee inspector, and he will give you all the advice you need on keeping your bees healthy and how to avoid some disasters, and he'll also be able to get in touch with you if there are any crises in the area which all beekeepers need to be made aware of. It's only going to cost you a very nominal annual charge to become a member of your local beekeeping society, and it's the best decision that you can make. They'll obviously be on hand to give you all the support and the advice that you need in your first years as you start to learn the skill of beekeeping. Okay, so here we are now. It's the end of the summer. We've taken the supers from the hives and we've extracted the honey. It's now essential that we replace that honey that we took from the bees with sugar syrup so that they can work that syrup and store it to see them through the winter. Now you need to do this with sugar syrup feeders. And there's so many different types of feeders on the market today that we've actually written a video dedicated to the subject of feeding. So rather than repeat all of that information here, for the subject of feeders, we'll just refer you to that video on the DVD. But it just remains to say in this video that if you are intending to take the honey from your hives this year, which after all is the whole purpose of keeping bees in the first place, then you will definitely need at least one feeder of whichever type you choose to get per hive. And the other piece of kit which we definitely want to make mention of, and probably the cheapest piece of kit in this list, is a simple notebook and pen. Every time you visit your apiary, especially if you have more than one hive, it's important to make a few brief notes of how you found each of the hives on that occasion. You'll quickly find that you develop your own abbreviations and codes which tell you how you found the hive, what jobs need doing on the hive, and help you keep an effective record of how your beekeeping is going throughout the year. It's an indispensable tool. Make sure you get into good habits of keeping records whenever you visit the hives, and you will be glad you did, because it makes the job of beekeeping much simpler and much more efficient when it comes to going back to your hives and trying to remember what pieces of equipment you needed to take with you. And the final piece of kit we want to mention in this video, which is a great piece of kit for new beekeepers to get hold of, is what's called a glass quilt. Now there's nothing soft and fluffy about a glass quilt. It's simply a transparent replacement for the crown board. And it's a great idea for new beekeepers to be able to just remove the outer telescoping lid of a hive and inspect the hive without disturbing the bees. Obviously there's advantages for the bees, and for the new beekeeper it helps ease him into opening the hive without being too nervous of all the bees flying around. Sometimes they're made of perspex instead of glass, and the advantage of perspex, although it's much easier to scratch, is that it's less subject to condensation. The inside of a beehive is a very moist, humid environment, and particularly when the weather gets cold, you can get droplets of water forming on the inside of the quilt, and this is no good for the bees. So for that reason, regardless of if it's perspex or glass, you never leave the glass quilt on over the winter. It's only a tool to be used during the summer to help new beekeepers get used to inspecting the hive. They're not that expensive to buy, and they're quite simple to make if you fancy having a go. So there we are. In conclusion, we'll just say that this is by no means an extensive list of all the pieces of beekeeping equipment that are available. It's not intended to be. If you have a look at the beekeeping websites or the different product catalogues, you'll see a never-ending list of useful little gadgets and contraptions. But we do hope that this has helped you think about some of the pieces of kit that you might want to get hold of to make your beekeeping easier, but most importantly, to help you think about the different options available to you in choosing which way to go in starting up in beekeeping. So now it's time to take a look at the hive itself and the story of how the modern beehive evolved. And to understand why the modern beehive works, then we need to start by looking at how bees naturally make their homes in the wild. As you can see from these pictures of wild beehives, the bees build their hives in caves or in hollowed out trees or in any cavity they can find, and even right out in the open, often up in trees in warmer climates. And the way they construct their home is by building a series of wax combs next to each other in very neat lines. They're completely parallel to each other, and the space between the combs is very accurately even. And if we study the pattern of how the bees use the different areas of each of the combs that they build, we can see that there is a clear pattern they follow. The bottom area of each comb is where the queen lays the brood, the new baby bees. And then around the top of that brood area, the worker bees, the foragers, will come and they will store all the pollen which they've gathered, which is used to feed the young. And then above that, in all other available space within the hive, the bees will store their honey crop, which they gather all summer long, and they store to see them through the cold winter when no pollen or nectar will be available. And then what the modern beekeeping hive, like the Langstroth and the British National design, do is simply take that design that the bees are happy with and place it inside a box. The main box of the hive is called the brood box or the brood chamber, where the queen works and where she rears the young, and then the smaller boxes placed on top are known as honey supers. And we'll look at all of the different components that make up the hive in the next video in much more detail. But here we want to focus on the different designs that you can choose between in setting up your own apiary of beehives. Now all of them follow exactly the same principle that we just discussed, but they all have very different dimensions and they're not compatible with each other, so it's important that you decide which one you're going to use from the outset and stick with that particular design so that all the equipment you acquire will be compatible. In the United States, Australia and New Zealand, by far the most commonly used hive standard is the Langstroth design, named after its inventor. It's readily available, it's a very simple rectangular construction and design, and it's by far the easiest hive to find and to get hold of. The Langstroth hive is available in the UK, but the most popular hive here is the British National design. It's a slightly smaller, squarer design than the Langstroth, and it's a bit more complicated in design and construction, but it's a lot easier to handle when wearing beekeeping equipment and gloves because of these good deep handles which are incorporated into the design all the way down the sides. The other difference between the two, the National and the Langstroth hive, is what we call warm way and cold way setup of the frames within the hives. The Langstroth is a cold way design, meaning that the frames are inserted perpendicular to the entrance. Whereas the National hive, because it's square, it can be set up for either a warm way or cold way arrangement of the frames. And with a warm way type hive, the frames are placed in parallel to the entrance, and this way the queen tends to lay her brood nearer the first half of the hive, which makes it easy when you come to inspect the brood chamber to start from the back and remove a couple of the frames, so that you've got plenty of space to work with by the time you get to the front half of the hive, and that reduces the risk of rolling the queen and damaging her as you take the frames out. But the other two hive designs which are worth mentioning in this video while we're discussing it are first of all the commercial hive, which is compatible with the British National. It's very similar specification, but it's a much simpler design, and it's also a lot bigger or deeper than the National hive. And a lot of medium-scale beekeepers here in the UK, including ourselves, we use homemade commercial brood chambers made from 18mm ply. They're very cheap to make and a very simple construction. And then we use the standard British National supers on top, because they're the easiest to handle when they're full of honey. But the last hive design to mention in this video is the WBC hive, and the WBC is what most people think of as the traditional beekeeper's beehive. But because it has such an intricate design, and the fact that it has two layers, an inner and an outer lifts as they're referred to, this means it's by far the most complicated design and also the most expensive design hive to set up with in the first place. So it's not really worth going for unless you've really got your heart set on it. And in conclusion, we just need to look at the different materials used, the options that you have in choosing which hives to buy. You can get hives made from plywood, as we mentioned. Polystyrene is popular in some places and with commercial beekeepers. But by far the most common beehive construction options which you have to choose from are either pine hives, which are cheaper, but they need to be painted or treated if you want them to last more than a few years. But by far the best option you have, all the best quality hives are always made from cedar. The natural oils within the cedar means that it doesn't even need any painting or treatment whatsoever, and a cedar hive is well worth paying a little bit extra for because it will last so much longer and you'll get many years of service from a cedar hive. Okay, so in this video we're taking a look at the feeders which we use to feed the bees sugar syrup and the different options available to us and how they all work. And if we think back to what we discussed about the basic design of a modern beehive, how it's developed, we know that the queen works in the brood chamber at the bottom of the hive. On top of that we put our queen excluder to stop her going up above that line, and then the honey supers are placed on the top. And the bees then will work hard all summer and they will fill potentially several of those supers for us, and then we come along and take it. So the least we can do to thank them for their hard work is make sure we replace that honey with sugar syrup, and the bees are more than happy with this honey substitute which we provide them. It's very simple to make up. It's simply 1 kilogram of common granulated cane sugar, and that is added to a litre of water. 1 kilogram of sugar to 1 litre of water. You can heat the water in a kettle or on a stove and just stir in the sugar until it's completely dissolved. But obviously we're not going to give hot syrup to the bees. It must have cooled down before we add it to a hive. Now this artificial nectar which we're making, we then feed back to the bees at the end of the summer after the honey flows have ended and the bees are looking for something to do to occupy their time. And however you choose to feed it to them, whichever type of feed you're going to use, you feed them the syrup along with a complete super of empty frames which we've extracted the honey from. And then the bees will take the syrup and they will process it by drinking it into their honey stomach, and they will then take it and completely refill that entire super of empty honey frames. And they will evaporate that down to the consistency of honey just as they would with normal nectar by fanning it with their wings, and they will seal it over exactly the same as they would do with real nectar which they'd gathered from flowers themselves. And this keeps the bees busy through the autumn so that by the time winter sets in they'll have plenty of reserves to see them through to the next spring. Now some beekeepers like to remove the queen excluder at the end of autumn. This is because when the cold winter months do set in, the bees over the winter will gather together in a very tight huddle, and this ball of bees, including the queen, will slowly make its way around the hive, surviving on the honey reserves right the way through the winter. And by having the queen excluder removed, this allows the queen free access right around the brood chamber and the honey super throughout the winter without being left behind by the mass of the bees. But if you're going to do that, you must make sure, of course, that when the spring arrives and you want to re-add the queen excluder to start the process all over again, it's vital that the queen is safely down below the queen excluder in the brood chamber before you add the queen excluder back on. So there's lots of different options for using feeders for giving them this syrup, and the simplest option is to use inverted jam jars. All you need to do is take a sharp nail and just punch some very small holes in the lid for the syrup to drip down through. And these can either be used in conjunction with entrance feeder trays. These are a very simple and easy option. They're very cheap. You pop them in the entrance like this, and the good thing about entrance feeders is that it's easy to see when they need refilling, and you don't need to disturb the hive in any way to insert them in the entrance of the hive. But one potential drawback with them, if the particular colony of bees isn't that strong, is that they're going to need to use a certain proportion of their workforce to protect the syrup from robber bees and from wasps who will try and get at the syrup as well. So the other way then to use these inverted jam jars is simply to put them over the hole which comes in the top of your crown board on top of the hive inside an empty super body. And then the main telescoping cover goes on top of that, obviously. You will notice, by the way, that when you first invert the jam jar, a certain amount of the honey syrup will drip out, but it will soon form a vacuum and it'll stop dripping, and there's no need to worry about that bit that's escaped. It lets the bees know that it's there, and they'll have it cleaned up in no time at all. Now there's lots of specially made high volume feeder trays which are on the market. They can be bought from bee suppliers and they match exactly the external dimensions of your beehive, so they'll just sit straight on top like a regular super would. Or if you enjoy carpentry, then these are a great project to make yourself. Here's one that follows the Miller feeder pattern which I made myself, and the exact dimensions and detailed plans of how they're made can be found readily online. If you look at a cross-section, you can see clearly how it works. It divides the feeder into these two trough sections, one either side of a central slot, which the bees can climb up and down and allows them access over the brim down into these feeder sections. And then there's two thin inner walls, which gives the bees a foothold and stops them drowning by falling into the syrup and floating away from the edges. If you're going to buy or make a Miller feeder, then do place it across the frames, perpendicular to the laying of the frames. This ensures that there's easy access to the bees, that if your bee space is slightly wrong and it happens to be sitting directly on top of one of the frames, then the bees won't be able to get up into the slot. Other types of feeder that are available are the trough type. This is simply designed to the exact specifications of one fully drawn brood frame, and you simply take out a brood frame from the back of the hive and insert the trough feeder in its place. But a potential problem with this design is that the bees need to build brace comb in it to prevent them falling in and drowning once again, so this is not the most popular design. But probably the simplest solution of all, and the most cost-effective if you don't want to use jam jars, is a design which incorporates the best design elements of all of the different types of feeder which we've already discussed. It's known as the rapid feeder. It's a very simple and cheap plastic design. You can get them from any beekeeping supplier, and it works on exactly the same principle as the Miller feeder, and it goes just like the jam jar above the crown board on top of your hive inside an empty super body. But whichever type of feeder you decide to use, the most important thing to note is when you use it. You only use it at the end of the summer, after you've taken the honey supers off, and when there's no honey flow on, when the bees are no longer busy gathering nectar. You don't feed them the syrup itself over the winter. You simply make sure you give it to them in plenty of time so that they can process the syrup and have it stored away in the super to see them through the winter months, long before the cold months of winter set in. Okay, so let's take a look at the basic components which make up a modern beehive. The first thing you want to put together is a good solid base like this one. You need to keep the hive nice and high off the ground, especially with long grass like this growing around the hive, to keep out pests, keep out rodents, and keep moisture away from the hive. Give the bees nice easy access in and out of the entrance of the hive. And the first component of the beehive itself is the hive floor. Now, as we said, traditionally they were made solid, but here we have one of the newer mesh floors, which is very good for the health of the beehive. First of all, it's easier for them to maintain the temperature of the hive, but also it helps to keep under control the varroa mite, which causes bees so much problems today. And this hive floor, you'll notice as well, also has an alighting board, a landing platform on the front to make it easier for the bees to get in and out of the hive once again. So the main component then to fit on top of the mesh floor is the brood chamber itself, or the hive body. This is a deep national hive body we've got here, full of frames, and we've put it on here warm way. Now, turning it around 90 degrees shows you the cold way, where the frames are aligned perpendicular. This is the system that the Langstroth hives use. But putting it back so the frames are aligned level with the entrance is the warm way, and this is the traditional arrangement for the national hive. If we take out one of the frames, you can see that it's a brand new, completely undrawn comb, ready for the bees to make their own and to get their teeth stuck into to draw that out. And these little plastic green things on the end are the spacers. If we take one off, you can see it's just slipped over the end of the frame to keep the frames nice and evenly spaced so that the bees will draw out the comb evenly. The next component, which sits directly on top of the brood chamber, is the queen excluder, and this is the wire type rather than the press type. And this again can go on either perpendicular or level with the frames. But we always put it on across the frames so that the bars don't sit directly on top of the frames, so that the bees have nice easy access up and down from the brood chamber into the honey supers and back down again. And then the other component which we'll take a look at, which comes with the beehive floor, is the entrance reducer. It's simply a block of wood which you fit into the entrance during winter to reduce the size of the entrance, to make temperature management and make security easier for a colony of bees. And if you've got a particularly weak and vulnerable colony, you can even reduce the entrance even more by flipping it around, turning it over 90 degrees. We have this very small entrance which only 1 or 2 bees can fit through, which will make it much easier for a weak colony to defend themselves through the winter. Okay, so the next component which is going to sit on top of your queen excluder is the honey super. 1 or more honey supers will be going on here, depending on how good the summer is. And as you can see, it's constructed to be a lot smaller, a lot shallower than the brood chamber itself. This is a standard shallow national super. And if I take out one of the frames, you can see that this also is completely undrawn, a brand new sheet of foundation ready for the bees to get their teeth stuck into and to start drawing out. Now if I move it back a little bit, so as we can take out one of the frames from the super and one from the brood chamber, you can see just how much deeper the brood chamber frame is from the honey super frame. And that's obviously because the super frames are so much heavier when they're completely full of honey. Having smaller ones makes them much easier to handle. And the last detail to point out regarding the super frames, if I tip it forward, you can see we've got the carcellated ridges, the galvanized metal strips along the edges of the hive, which we use instead of spacers in the honey supers. The purpose is exactly the same. It keeps the space between the frames exactly even and makes sure that the bees draw out that comb nice and evenly, which will make it all the more easier to uncap and extract when they're full of honey. And the next piece of kit to go on top of however many honey supers you're going to have on top of your hive is the crown board. This is a simple piece of plywood. It has the battens fixed around the edges to give it its bee space on the underside. And all of these crown boards will have 1 or more of these holes fitted in them so that mesh can be removed. We've got it meshed over so that it still provides ventilation with the hive, but the bees can't get through it. But if you remove that mesh, then the holes can be used either to put a bee feeder on top of as a feeder board, or they can be fitted with bee escapes to use the crown board as a clearer board when you want to take the honey off the hives. And the final component of the beehive is the outer lid, the telescoping cover as it's known. This is built to be as heavy and as solid as you can. This one we've covered with fiberglass to make it heavier and to make sure it's completely waterproof. And this also has 2 vents covered with mesh to keep pests out of the hive, but to provide ventilation to make sure that the hive doesn't have a problem with condensation and moisture. And that simply slips down over the crown board and the top super or the hive body, and there we are. You have a completed beehive which any colony of bees is going to be happy to call home. And the final detail to mention in this video is the alternative use for the crown board. In the autumn time, after you've taken the honey supers off, you pop the crown board directly on top of the brood chamber. You remove this piece of mesh to open up the hole that's been cut in the crown board so that the bees can get up and down through the hole. And then you place your rapid feeder filled with sugar syrup directly over the hole so that the bees can climb up and down easily from the brood chamber and take all that syrup down and store it as honey. All you need to do then is take an empty super body from one of the supers which you've extracted the honey from the frames. You place that directly over the crown board and the feeder, and that way when the telescoping cover goes on, you only need to remove the one cover, the outer cover itself, to get access to the feeder, to refill that and ensure that the bees have plenty of syrup to see them through the winter. Okay, so now it's time to talk about the bees themselves. Apis mellifera is the proper name for the honeybee species, and you probably already know that there's 3 distinct castes within the species, 2 female and 1 male. The queen bee, first of all, she's the only single bee of her caste within the hive. If more queen bees are bred within the hive, then they will fight to the death until only 1 remains. And it's a common anthropomorphic misconception that the queen is in charge, that the worker bees are her subjects and work for her. The fact is that the workers control the queen. She is completely dependent upon them, and if she's not being productive, if she's in any way defective according to them, then they will supersede her. They will reject her and kill her by forming a tight ball around her, completely suffocating her, and replace her as they see fit. The queen bee can be quite hard to spot when you're new to beekeeping, when you first start going through the hives, because it's so busy, so many bees running everywhere. But as you can see from these pictures, she is distinctly different, and you'll soon start to be able to find her easier as you go through the hives a few times over. As you can see from this picture, she might not be obvious first of all, and yet when you do spot her, if I highlight her here, you can see clearly that she's very different, much longer, often they're a lot less stripy, completely different shape. The other point you'll notice as you start to go through the hives more is the thing that makes the queen stand out is the different way that she moves from the other bees. She moves in a very deliberate, very busy and very purposeful way, and it's the movement that makes her stand out from the others. The drones were the second caste. These are the males of the beehive, and they're very easy to find and very distinctive because they're so much bigger than the worker bees. They're much bigger, much fatter, and they have huge eyes in comparison to the others. Beginners often make the mistake of seeing a lone drone and thinking that it's the queen, but again, once you've been in there a few times in the summer, you'll soon see the difference when you see them next to each other. The drones don't have any sting. They do no work whatsoever within the community. They are simply there to mate with new queens each summer. So you only see them during the summer. Anytime from mid-spring up until the end of summer, there may well be drones in some of the hives. But once summer has passed and the hives are settled and the workers are happy with their current queen, whether she's a new queen or their existing queen from the previous year, they simply turf out the drones because they're no longer needed. They'll refuse them entrance to the hives, then they'll die off very quickly outside the hive. And this takes us to the final caste of bees, the worker bees, and this caste accounts for the vast majority of bees within any hive. They live for about a month to 6 weeks during the summer, when they actually work themselves to death. We know this because bees that are born in the late autumn, who live a much more idle life because there's no honey flows on and there's less flying to be done, they can live for several months. But as the hive numbers drop off down into winter, when the queen stops laying, they'll drop to anything below 10,000 bees within the colony. And then once spring breaks and the queen starts laying again, she'll quickly build the colony up to anything over 50,000 worker bees within the colony. And as soon as each new bee is born, she immediately sets to work and follows a very exact sequence of specific duties within the hive. Her very first job, just moments after being born, is to start cleaning the combs out, ready for new eggs to be laid by the queen, and shortly after she'll move on to feeding the new young bees, the larvae and the eggs as they grow. And throughout the first few weeks of her life, she'll move on to different positions and do stints at attending the queen and feeding her. Then she'll move on to different housekeeping duties, to handling the resources of the hive. She does a period of wax production and temperature management and a whole host of other jobs which are all instinctively programmed within her brain and are triggered at a set time, until this instinct will tell her that the time has come to move down to the entrance of the hives, to take up guard duty. And as you probably know, stinging for a bee is usually fatal. The whole rear of their body rips off and they die shortly afterwards, but she'll gladly give her life for her sister bees and for her queen. And during this period, she also makes a series of practice flights while she's on guard duty, and mapping flights, where she'll fly around the hive many times and come back back, and she stores in her brain a series of photographic references of the exact position of where the hive is from any direction. And if the hive is even moved just a couple of feet away, the flying bees can be completely lost and unable to find it because the photographic references are so exact. At this point, when she starts to fly, she'll be around 3 weeks old, approximately halfway through her life, and it's now time for her to go back into the hive and watch the famous waggle dance of the foraging bees who've returned with nectar or pollen. They do this to tell their sisters where the best foraging opportunities are at the moment, and the information contained within the dance gives the new bees the exact distance and the exact bearing in relation to the current position of the sun that they need to fly to start their foraging duties. And off she'll go, and the entire second half of her life she'll spend gathering pollen, nectar, tree sap or water, whatever is needed within the hive, until she literally wears her wings to tatters. And once a bee reaches this guard duty stage and starts flying, then her suicidally defensive instincts will kick in and they'll stay active for the rest of her life. That's why we never approach a hive from the front, and we'll discuss that in more detail later on in the training as well. So the best time to visit a hive from this point of view is right in the middle of a warm day, when most of the flying bees will be out in the field. The younger nurse bees who haven't yet left the hive will not have nearly such a strong stinging and defensive instinct, and they won't be inclined to sting unless they're severely agitated and feel threatened. And also of note with the worker bees is that they're not at all interested in stinging in defense when they're away from the hive. It's only in the defense of their home that they'll be willing to attack, and you can actually observe bees when they're foraging quite close up and they won't mind at all. Beginners sometimes mistake wasps and other types of bees for honeybees, but when you see them next to each other, you soon become quite clear as to what the differences are. If we put a honeybee next to a wasp, you can see the yellow and black stripes are much more defined in the wasp, and it also has this armor-plating type skin, unlike the honeybee, who's much more leathery in texture and has the furry legs. And the bumblebees often as well can be mistaken. People don't realize how small bumbles can be and how much thinner they can be than people would imagine them to be. But in comparison, once again, you quickly start to learn to identify the species in comparison with each other. Now, as we've mentioned previously, there's different varieties of honeybee within the Apis mellifera species. Italians and Caucasians from North Asia are probably the most common that you're likely to encounter of the specific varieties, and they're often bred in their pure strain at various locations across the world, as is the buckfast bee, which is a lovely honeybee which was selectively bred over the entire lifetime of the famous monk bee breeder Brother Adam from Buckfast Abbey in England. And buckfast bee agents can also be found breeding the buckfast bee at many places throughout the world. Carniolans then are another very popular breed. These are very busy bees, absolutely prolific in their breeding and their honey production. They hail from Slovenia originally, and they do very well in the Northern Hemisphere, in Europe and in North America, and this is the variety of bee that we keep in our apiaries. But they take a lot of work, they need a lot of swarm management, and they're not at all the easiest bee for a new beekeeper to get started with. But the most common advice you'll get in choosing which bees to get hold of yourself is probably the best advice overall. What most people will tell you is to buy your bees or to obtain your bees from a locally established beekeeper. This is because bees are very quick to adapt to their surroundings, and as they breed over several generations, they will become more attuned to the area in which they live. So obtaining bees from your locality is going to give you very well-rounded, suitable bees for the area that you live in. And good established local bees invariably make the best option for new beekeepers just starting up. Okay, so we established that one of the most essential pieces of kit that you need to get right at the outset is a bee smoker. And now we're going to look in detail at how you light and how you use the smoker. But the first thing that it's important we understand is why we use the smoker, what effect it has on the bees, and how that is to the beekeeper's advantage. Now, you'll often hear beekeepers say that the smoke calms the bees, and that is the appearance of the effect that the smoke has on them, but in fact it's more distracting them than calming them down. because it's long been known that when bees smell the smoke from a fire that's wafting towards and inside their hive, then they instinctively react by stopping whatever it is they're doing, and they rush off and gorge themselves on honey that's stored within the hive. It's a kind of well-rehearsed emergency fire drill that's been designed into their instincts, so that if the hive catches fire, or they smell the smoke and think that the fire is coming towards the hive, then they'll be able to abandon the hive and have plenty of reserves stored to go off and find a new hive. So this has two direct effects on the bees which the beekeeper can use to his advantage. First of all, it preoccupies the bees. It distracts them and gets them focused on doing this very important job, which becomes their priority, and it distracts them from the disturbance that you've created, which they will come and investigate when you go in the hive. But also, as has previously been noted, it's very hard for the bees to sting you when their honey stomach is full. They can't bend around so easily to put their sting in. So that's why we use a smoker when we go in the hives. Now, the fuel for the smoker can be anything that's natural. Wood is obviously the ideal. Wood shavings or wood chippings, as long as they're dry, they'll be the best fuel that you can get. Or you can use paper and cardboard as well. Now, this is usually the easiest fuel to get hold of, but if you're going to use card, especially the corrugated, the thicker type of card, then you need to make sure that it doesn't have any of the glue in it, which causes a kind of black tar residue inside your smoker. This glue gives off a very smelly, very sticky kind of smoke, which the bees don't like at all. It just aggravates the bees and makes them grumpy. Obviously, you shouldn't use any solvents or gasoline, or don't burn anything that's going to make fumes, which also will aggravate the bees. Make sure that you stick to completely natural sources of fuel. Personally, I just cut a patch of long grass at the height of summer, leave it in the hot sun for a week to turn to hay and to be completely bone dry, and then just bag it up in individual plastic bags, and that'll be enough fuel to last you through the year until the following summer. Okay, so now let's take a look at how to light and how to use the smoker. Okay, so we light the bee smoker as we would with any fire. Just use a piece of old newspaper. You light the paper down close to the smoker so that it's not going to go out as you carry it to the smoker. And then once that's lit and you've got it inside, you start pumping the bellows straight away and adding fuel all the time. Don't stop pumping it as you add the fuel. Then you can start packing the fuel in nice and tight as long as that fire is burning well. Pack it in as tight as you can to keep the smoker burning for as long as possible. But it's very important that you remember to keep the smoker upright at all times when it's been lit. When you're not using the smoker between hives, the heat rising inside the smoker and the smoke coming out of the top spout will automatically draw more air in through the bottom hole down by the bellows, even when you're not pumping it, and that will just keep it burning away slowly and stop it from going out. If you lay the smoker down on its side, then it'll go out very quickly. And then to use the smoker on the hive is very straightforward. Start at the entrance, obviously, give it a good puff of smoke in the entrance. And if you're using a mesh floor, then it's good to give it a good puff of smoke underneath, because the smoke will naturally then waft up into the hive through all of the hive. After you've removed the outer cover, you can give it another puff of smoke under the crown board, leave it a second before you remove it, before you expose the hive to daylight. And once inside the hive, if any of the bees are still not happy with you being there, then you can just keep giving them regular puffs of smoke until they think better of it and they leave you alone and go off to fetch honey themselves. Okay, so now we come to the subject of bee stings, and the first thing that everybody wants to know about when they think about keeping bees is how not to get stung. But the first thing to acknowledge if you do want to keep bees is that you will inevitably get stung before long. But it's worth noting right from the outset that you will quickly realize that it's the fear of being stung which causes most of the problems rather than the reaction to the sting itself. The first couple of times you get stung, you're so worried about it that the adrenaline kicks in, that you panic to some extent and your blood starts pumping faster, and it can seem a lot worse than it is. But quickly, after being stung a few times, you get used to it. It still hurts, but you realize that it's just like getting stung by a stinging nettle, and it doesn't actually hurt that much. You don't panic, you keep calm, you react in a calm way and scrape the sting out quickly, and you just kind of get on with it, you get used to it, and it really doesn't bother you that much. But of course we want to avoid getting stung as much as possible, and there's a few basic rules to help us do this. First of all, you simply don't bother the bees when you know they're going to be in a bad mood. On a cold day, if it's very wet, if it's very thundery, then you know that if you go in the hive, they're going to react much more angrily than if they were contented. So the best time to go into the hive is always at the middle of a good day. First of all, like we've said, the bees will be in a better mood generally when they've got nothing to worry about and they're busy with various jobs. But the main reason is that over half of the population of the hives will be out foraging anyway, so there's less bees there to worry about in the first place. The next rule is not to approach the hive from the front. The front of the hive is the area that the guard bees will be covering, and if you approach from the back, they won't even know that you're there, and they won't raise the alarm. But most importantly, as you get used to the bees and as you relax more in handling them, then you will naturally start to move more calmly and gently as possible. You certainly don't want to be swatting around, waving your arms, or banging the hive or the bees in any way. All this kind of activity is just going to aggravate them, and the more relaxed you are, the more relaxed they will be. But finally, to give you a bit of confidence as you start to get used to the bees while you still are nervous, give yourself a good puff of smoke all over before you go and see the bees. We've already explained what effect the smoke has on the bees, and it'll give you a lot more confidence, and they'll tend to bother you less as they react to the smell of the smoke. But when that first inevitable sting does come along, it's very important that you react in the right way. You don't want to panic, you want to make sure that you keep calm, but it's important that you remove the venom sac correctly. Don't forget that when the bee stings you, the bee stays in and she pulls away, leaving the venom sac behind. And there's a muscle in that sac which will continue to pump the venom into you through the sting. So what you mustn't do is grab that venom sac between your finger and thumb and pull it out. All you'll be doing then is forcing more venom in through the sting, and the sting will be much worse. Rather, you need to scrape it out either with your fingernail or the edge of your hive tool is perfect for this, and just scrape it out quickly but calmly to make sure that the amount of venom that's pumped in is kept to the absolute minimum. But as well as the sting pumping in the venom, it will also give off a pheromone, which the other bees will recognize as a warning and as a signal for them to sting that same area. So if you get stung while you're in the middle of handling the bees and the hive is disassembled and you can't just walk away, then give the area that you've been stung a good puff of smoke, which will mask that pheromone and prevent more stings. Now that's really all you need to worry about regarding stings. You'll soon get used to it, as we've said. But just to be on the safe side, let's just cover the 3 different types of reaction to bee stings that you might experience. Now the first type is the most common, just the local reaction. The symptoms of this are obviously the pain, the stinging pain from the venom. And then shortly afterwards, the area will swell just locally and it'll congeal under the skin and go quite hard for a few days. And that will probably be sore and it will itch for a couple of days afterwards. But it'll quickly wear off and you can reduce the swelling and the itching with just a local topical antihistamine cream, which you can buy over the counter at a pharmacy. But the second type of reaction, which you sometimes get, and you never really know when this is going to affect you, as well as the local reaction, is that you can sometimes get an allergic reaction as well. It depends on where you get stung and the kind of dose that you get. But if that venom finds its way into your bloodstream, then sometimes you can get this allergic reaction. And this is often a much wider swelling in the hands or fingers, or sometimes in your face or neck, depending on where you get stung. You may well come out in a rash as well, and sometimes you can feel quite sick and nauseous and even quite dizzy. But it doesn't last very long, and the quickest way to deal with it is with antihistamine tablets. So make sure you keep a good dose of antihistamines in your beekeeping kit. Carry them with you in case this affects you, because it can be quite alarming if you've never had it before. And the other thing to bear in mind is that a lot of antihistamines will make you very drowsy, so it's important to be aware that you mustn't drive if you've taken these kinds of antihistamines. So that's all you really need to worry about regarding bee stings, but just to cover everything thoroughly, the last kind of reaction to bee stings is the most serious. It only affects a tiny proportion of the population, and it's known as a reaction called anaphylactic shock, which can be very serious. It can even cause cardiac arrest and death, and the only real treatment is an adrenaline syringe. But it's extremely rare. It's not something that most of us need to worry about ever, unless you are particularly sensitive to bee stings. And if you are, then you're probably sensitive to a whole host of other things as well, and you probably are already aware of this. And if this is the case, if you are worried, then it's obviously going to be best to rethink your plans, and probably best not to keep bees at all.